A recent ADHD diagnosis can leave you feeling completely alone, especially if you're an adult. That was my experience a few years ago when I found out that I had ADHD after turning 40. I didn't know anything about ADHD. What was it? Or where to even find information, let alone a sense of solidarity with other late diagnosed adults. Looking back over decades of failures and disappointments, the feeling of why am I wired so differently was really isolating at first. Here's the good news. In 2025, there are a ton of great resources for recently diagnosed ADHDers. So, in this video, I'm going to share the ones that really were most impactful and most helpful for me when I began the journey. Now, before I get into it, there's a little bit more good news. The research and the body of literature out there on ADHD is expanding super quickly. And with more and more resources becoming available, this video is really not going to be exhaustive. I'll continue to share those resources as I find them, so be sure to hit subscribe and stay up to date. Post diagnosis, I felt really alone and pretty lost. Like I was stranded in Antarctica and I didn't know which way was north. I needed some resources to use as guideposts to orient me. Living nearly 4 decades, somewhat haphazardly, just randomly, I knew I needed to follow a process so that my ADHD diagnosis wouldn't just be another random event in life. I needed to approach it systematically. You see, I had been consulting for a number of years, and I had plenty of experience breaking down big strategic problems in organizations into smaller steps. But in the organization of my own life, or the lack thereof, as the case was for me, I knew that years of chaos wouldn't magically fix themselves without going through a similar process. And for me, that involved three key steps or three key elements: identity, knowledge, and community. I would need all the resources that I could get across these areas. And I'll cover identity and community in future videos. For today, I really want to dive into how I went from zero knowledge of ADHD to quickly understanding some of the science and psychology and the key terms that we need to know as ADHDers. I asked myself, what can I learn about ADHD? Well, my go-to learning method has always been it's always been books. And I was fortunate to get some great recommendations early on during my ADHD journey. Reading is not it's not easy, but I really have always loved to kind of dive in deep on subjects, and I think that books are the best way for me to do that. The first book that was recommended was actually given to me by I think my wife, and it's ADHD 2.0 by Dr. Ned Hallowell. And he's a leading expert on ADHD. He's been practicing for 30 years as a clinician. And what was most eye opening for me about this title was really the breadth of the info in such a short read. It's only about 150 pages long. In one chapter, you might be reading about neuroscience and diving deep on the default mode network versus the task positive network. But the next chapter, you're reading about the importance of social integration in healing from a sort of psychology and sociology perspective. So for me, Dr. Hallowell's breadth of experience really shines through, and it was super clear in his anecdotes. You see, every chapter has maybe one to two stories from his patients that reminded me actually of myself. Most of them overcame their struggles with ADHD, so that was really, really helpful. The second book is Healing ADD by Dr. Daniel Amen. Now, I was familiar with Dr. Amen's work from Instagram and from during COVID. I had heard a lot about mental health, and Dr. Amen is a leading mental health expert based on his years of experience conducting brain scans. And he has tons and tons of data. It's really, really interesting. So, in this book, Healing ADD, he describes 7 distinct types of ADHD based on his brain scanning data. And for each one, he's got different protocols that can be very, very useful in treating that type of ADD. I think it's very much worth the read. Chapter 19 really stuck out to me: dietary interventions for ADD types. And chapter 20, supplement strategies for ADD types. Really, both of those have changed my approach to what I'm putting in my body, and I'll share more about that in future videos. Go ahead and give me a like and subscribe if you can. Just let me know that in the comments that that's something that you'd be interested in from this channel if you want to hear more about the health side of this. All right, the next one is actually not an ADHD book. It's on my annual reading list: Atomic Habits by James Clear. This is something that I have to go back to over and over and over again. You see, for me, habits are kind of terrifying. I've always had a lot of bad habits, very few good ones. I think, like a lot of ADHDers, I struggle immensely with sticking to a routine. Well, James Clear's advice on habit stacking has been super practical, and the focus on systems over goals is especially crucial for my ADHD brain. As we go into the new year, I'm like a lot of people. I see the shiny object, the goal itself, the goal setting process itself as the shiny object, but then I never put the systems into practice or into my calendar of when I'm going to work on each of these goals. So setting the goal, writing it down releases a ton of dopamine. Better yet, telling people about the goal, maybe on Instagram or telling friends, family, that releases another bit of dopamine. But actually working on the goal, man, that's the hard part. And that's where James Clear's Atomic Habits has been really, really, really beneficial. I would recommend this to anyone interested in becoming the best version of themselves and achieving their goals, ADHD or no. All right. Final book recommendation on the list right now is The ADHD Advantage by Dr. Dale Archer. This one for me is pretty new actually. I picked it up at my library book sale for $2 a couple of weeks ago, but I added it to the list even though I haven't read it yet. I got into the intro and I found it super inspiring. He argues that in the right context, ADHD can actually be a great asset. I think this is a really hopeful message to share in this community. Finally, just a quick hot take on reading versus implementing. There's a lot of people out there that can brag about how much they read, but they never actually do anything with what they learn. In other words, they don't execute. I should know that was me for a long time. Maybe you feel the same. But knowledge without execution is really, really limited. I needed a resource, and I currently need a resource that's going to help me put into practice some of the things that I'm learning. All these doctors can make great recommendations, they have excellent protocols, but at some point, we have to put pen to paper. So, next up for me is the Adult ADHD and Anxiety Workbook by Dr. Russell Ramsey. Formerly of the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Ramsey is an expert on the connection between that a lot of us face between ADHD and anxiety, whether that anxiety is naturally born of our experience or as a product oftentimes of the trauma that we live in from the chaos caused by ADHD. So I think that the workbook is really going to help me and anybody else to put into practice some of those CBT techniques that we learn about, some of the protocols. Let me know in the comments if you'd like me to review that workbook as I get into the exercises. Of course, like a lot of ADHDers, I really find focused reading pretty difficult. And naturally, I actually tend to be more of an auditory learner, more inclined to finish a podcast or an audiobook or even a YouTube video on ADHD than getting through 25 pages of a physical book. So I definitely wanted to share, if you're feeling the same, let me know in the comments. But I really wanted to share a couple of the podcasts that I had found most helpful, especially when I was recently diagnosed. First, because I was really battling the ADHD stigma after my diagnosis and my own disbelief that it was even a legitimate diagnosable condition. Some of the internal shame about having missed the mark my entire life. So I decided to go to resources that I already trusted. People who would talk about ADHD but weren't necessarily incentivized to prescribe medicine or to share their protocol. They weren't making any money off of talking about ADHD. I felt like they could be a little bit more objective. And the first one was that I started with was Dr. Andrew Huberman. I had been listening to the Huberman Lab for a number of years, and I came across a couple of episodes specifically on ADHD on his podcast where he really deep dive. Before I even knew really the term hyperfocus, I found myself deep diving alongside of him on the role of dopamine and habit formation, motivation, how it plays into that, and reconsidering some of the routines that I was struggling to follow. Huberman introduced me to a lot of the really data driven protocols that could replace some of my previous lack of willpower. I think his science based approach was super helpful and also very hopeful as I started going down the rabbit hole into the research. Another slightly more scientific resource that I came across was Dr. Russell Barkley on YouTube. Now, Dr. Barkley is a leading expert on the causes and effects of ADHD, both in children and adults, and his talks on undiagnosed adult ADHD were really, really eye opening. An ADHD diagnosis late in life is naturally very emotional. It can be a pretty gripping experience. And for me, it was super important to find some more human resources in addition to just the raw science. One was ADHD Chatter. Initially, I think my wife shared this podcast with me on Spotify, and really early on in the journey, in fact. But in typical ADHD fashion, it took me a few months to actually click in. When I finally got around to pushing play, Alex Partridge, the host, his wonderful English accent immediately put me at ease. His videos and his podcast feature terrific guests with deep experience across psychology and psychiatric practice, but as well as human relationships. Another one was actually Jessica McCabe's TEDx talk. How to ADHD is her podcast channel, but initially I was introduced to Jessica through her TEDx talk, Failing at Normal. Before I was even diagnosed with ADHD, uh, I was researching this stuff, and I was like, "Oh, I love TED Talks. She's got ADHD. Let me just see if something relates." Well, actually, her story of coping with undiagnosed ADHD, she was diagnosed relatively early. I mean, as a teenager, I think, but it felt just like mine. And I quickly became one of Jessica's nearly 2 million subscribers on YouTube. Definitely go check in with her videos. The next one is a YouTube channel called ADHD Vision. I actually found Nick on Instagram, and he's an awesome creator. It's both informative, inspiring, and entertaining. He's kind of funny, he's kind of quirky, and I really felt a sense of the global community that he's been able to build over the past several years. All right, last one is ADDitude Magazine. It's kind of a play on words, ADDitude. It's a terrific resource. Full disclosure, I've never been a big regular website reader. I couldn't stick with blog reading every single day because I usually forget to go back to the website. I don't even remember where I put my bookmarks. ADDitudemag.com is a great place to start if you're recently diagnosed. It includes topics like getting things done, time and productivity, and organization. So this was really, really helpful for me because I knew that I had been struggling in these areas long before I ever knew anything about the executive functions. So I try to read one article or so each day, every other day on Attitude Mag, and I'll share some of the helpful ones that I find in my weekly newsletter that I'm launching in early 2026. Just a little teaser there. I wanted to plug that, so be on the lookout. But for now, make sure to like and subscribe because I'm going to continue to review and share my top ADHD resources here on the channel. I'll see you in the next video.